The 75-year-old woman was ignored at the jewelry store, but when she opened her purse in front of everyone, she showed that she was the new owner. Pearl Washington's Cartier handbag barely made a sound as it settled onto the gleaming glass counter at Morton's Fine Jewelry in downtown Boston. The saleswoman behind the counter, Cassidy, didn't even look up from her phone. Pearl cleared her throat softly, the diamond tennis bracelet on her wrist catching the store's recessed lighting as she moved. Still nothing. At 75, Pearl had grown accustomed to these moments. They no longer sparked the hot anger they once did in her younger years. Now, they amused her more than anything else. She'd learned long ago that patience was a weapon all its own. "Excuse me," Pearl said, her voice carrying the gentle lilt of her Louisiana upbringing. "I'd like to speak with someone about purchasing this establishment." That got Cassidy's attention. The young woman's head snapped up, blue eyes widening as they took in Pearl's elegantly tailored Oscar de la Renta suit and the subtle glint of her Van Cleef and Arpels earrings. I'm sorry, what did you say?" Cassidy stammered, finally slipping her phone into her pocket. "The store, dear. I'd like to discuss acquiring it." Pearl maintained her warm smile, even as she noticed two other employees drifting closer, their faces masks of barely concealed skepticism. The store manager, a middle-aged man with graying temples who'd been watching the exchange from his office, emerged with a practiced smile. "Ma'am, I'm afraid there must be some misunderstanding. Morton's isn't for sale." Pearl reached into her handbag and retrieved a leather portfolio, placing it carefully on the counter. "Actually, Mr. Barrett, that is your name, correct? Morton's has been for sale for the past 3 months. Your parent company, Luxury Retail Holdings, has been quietly shopping for buyers." She opened the portfolio, revealing a stack of documents. "I've already had several discussions with their board of directors." The manager's smile faltered as he glanced at the paperwork, recognizing the corporate letterhead and confidential watermarks. Pearl could see the calculations happening behind his eyes, the rapid reassessment of the elderly black woman standing before him. "I made my fortune in tech," Pearl continued, her voice as smooth as aged bourbon. "But my first job was in a jewelry store much like this one, in Birmingham, 1964. She let that year hang in the air for a moment. I wasn't allowed to touch the jewelry back then, could only clean the floors." The silence in the store grew thick. Other customers had stopped browsing to watch the scene unfold. Pearl could feel their eyes on her, but she kept her attention focused on Mr. Barrett, who was now frantically scanning the documents. "My company, Washington Digital Solutions, has been diversifying into luxury retail," Pearl explained, producing a business card from her portfolio. "I believe Morton's would make an excellent addition to our portfolio. Though, of course, some changes would need to be made to the current customer service approach." Cassidy's face had turned a shade of red that nearly matched the signature Morton's jewelry boxes lining the shelves behind her. Mr. Barrett's hands trembled slightly as he reached for Pearl's business card. "Mrs. Washington, we had no idea. Please, accept my sincere apologies for the wait. Would you like to continue this discussion in my office?" Pearl closed her portfolio with deliberate care. "Actually, I think I'd prefer to speak with your regional director. I have his number right here." She pulled out her phone, its screen displaying a contact labeled Richard Morton III, CEO. "Unless, of course, there's another customer you need to attend to first." The manager's face paled. No, of course not. Please, allow me to call him right away." As Mr. Barrett hurried back to his office, Pearl caught her reflection in one of the store's many mirrors. She saw not just herself, but the ghost of that young girl from Birmingham, who'd spent countless hours watching other women try on beautiful things she wasn't allowed to touch. That girl had made herself a promise, one that had driven her through decades of hard work, discrimination, and triumph. Now, standing in the middle of what would soon be her own jewelry store, Pearl Washington allowed herself a small, satisfied smile. Sometimes, the best revenge wasn't served cold. It was served with impeccable manners and a platinum American Express card. The day was just beginning, and Pearl had a feeling it was going to be a memorable one. After all, this was only the first store on her list. The wheels of Pearl's Bentley crunched over fallen leaves as Marcus, her driver of 15 years, guided them away from Morton's. Through the tinted windows, She watched Boston's financial district slide past, its glass towers reflecting the autumn sunlight. Her phone buzzed for the fourth time. Richard Morton III was persistent. She had to give him that. "Shall I take you home, Mrs. Washington?" Marcus asked, catching her eye in the rearview mirror. "No," Pearl replied, finally answering her phone. "Take me to Cambridge. There's someone I need to see." Richard Morton's voice burst through the speaker before she could even say hello. "Mrs. Washington, I cannot apologize enough for the treatment you received at our Boston location. I've already spoken with Mr. Barrett, and I assure you—" "Richard," Pearl interrupted gently, "save your apologies. I'm not interested in disciplinary actions or corporate hand-wringing. I'm interested in buying your company, and after today's experience, my offer just dropped by 15%. The silence on the other end was deafening. Pearl continued, "Have the paperwork ready by Monday. My lawyers will be in touch." She ended the call before he could respond. The Bentley crossed the Harvard Bridge, and Pearl felt the familiar tug of memories. She'd earned her MBA here 30 years ago, attending night classes while building her first software company from scratch. Now she served on the university's board of trustees, but today's visit was an official business. Marcus pulled up to a modest brownstone near Harvard Square. Despite the autumn chill, Dr. Regina Matthews was tending to the small garden in front of her home, her silver hair tucked under a worn Red Sox cap. At 78, Regina had been Pearl's first mentor, the only other black woman in her MBA program, and now her closest friend. "You're either celebrating or plotting," Regina said by way of greeting, pulling off her gardening gloves. "And since you're here in the middle of the day, I'm betting it's both." Pearl laughed, linking arms with her friend as they headed inside. Regina's home was a testament to a life well lived, walls lined with books, photos of her years teaching economics at Harvard, and artifacts from her travels across Africa and Asia. The two women settled into their usual spots in the sunny kitchen nook. "I'm buying Morton's," Pearl announced as Regina prepared tea. "All of it? The whole chain?" Regina's hands stilled over the teapot. "Morton's? The same Morton's that wouldn't let you shop there in '85 when you got your first big contract?" "The very same." Pearl pulled out her tablet, showing Regina the preliminary acquisition documents. "But that's not why I'm here. I need your help planning what comes next." Regina studied her friend's face over the rim of her teacup. "You've got that look, Pearl. The same one you had when you started offering free coding classes in Roxbury. Because this isn't just about owning a jewelry store chain." Pearl leaned forward, her voice intense. "It's about creating opportunities. When I was cleaning floors in Birmingham, do you know what kept me going? Watching the way light played off the diamonds, the way gold caught the sun. I used to imagine designing pieces that told our stories." Understanding dawned on Regina's face. "You want to transform Morton's? I want to create a mentorship program for young black jewelers and designers. I want to establish a foundation that provides business education and startup capital for minority entrepreneurs in the luxury retail space. Morton's has 43 locations across the country. That's 43 opportunities to change lives." Regina set down her cup and reached for her laptop. "Well then, we better start planning. Have you thought about partnering with the National Museum of African American History? Their jewelry collection could provide historical context for new designers." For the next several hours, the two women worked as they had so many times before, building something new from the bones of the old. Pearl's phone continued to buzz with messages from Richard Morton III, but she let them go unanswered. The real work was happening right here, in a sunny kitchen in Cambridge, with the woman who had shown her what was possible. As the afternoon light began to fade, Regina asked the question Pearl had been expecting. "What about Cassidy, the girl from the store?" Pearl smiled, remembering the young woman's mortified face. "I'm not going to fire her. Sometimes the best teachers are our own mistakes. Besides," she added, pulling up Morton's employee records on her tablet, "according to this, she's putting herself through college, working full-time, taking night classes. Remind you of anyone?" Regina laughed, the sound rich with understanding. "You're going to mentor her, aren't you?" "Change doesn't happen by pushing people away," Pearl said, thinking of all the doors that had been closed to her over the years. "It happens by opening new ones. Now, help me draft this announcement. We're going to need to make quite a statement on Monday." Outside, the Harvard bells tolled the evening hour, their deep tones echoing across the campus where Pearl had once dared to dream bigger than anyone thought possible. Soon, those same bells would ring in a new chapter for Morton's, and for all the dreamers who had ever pressed their faces against a jewelry store window, seeing their futures shining back at them. Monday morning arrived with the kind of crisp certainty that only October in New England could deliver. Pearl sat in the executive conference room of Morton's headquarters in downtown Providence, Rhode Island, watching Richard Morton free fidget with his Mont-Blanc pen. The wall of windows behind him offered a sweeping view of the city, but all eyes in the room were fixed on Pearl. "Mrs. Washington," Richard began, his voice carrying the polished smoothness of old money, "I've reviewed your revised offer with the board. While the reduction in price is unexpected, we're prepared to move forward." He slid a thick folder across the mahogany table. "However, I must ask about your plans for the company. Morton's has been in my family for 4 generations." Pearl didn't immediately reach for the folder. Instead, she removed her reading glasses and looked directly at Richard. "Tell me, Mr. Morton, do you know who designed the signature diamond setting that made your great-grandfather famous in 1923? Richard blinked, caught off guard by the question. "Of course. It was my great-grandfather himself. The Morton Classic setting is still our most popular design." "No," Pearl said quietly, pulling up an image on her tablet. "It was designed by Henry Jefferson, a black artisan who worked in your great-grandfather's workshop. I found his original sketches in the Charleston Historical Society archives." She turned the tablet to show a yellow drawing, signed in a careful hand. "He was never credited, never compensated beyond his weekly wage of $3. He died working as a janitor in 1955. The room fell silent. Pearl could see Richard's lawyers exchanging uncomfortable glances. She continued, "I'm not telling you this to shame your family, Mr. Morton. I'm telling you because Morton's has a chance to correct its course, to become something greater than its past." She finally reached for the folder, removing a single sheet of paper from her own portfolio and placing it on top. "This is my plan for the Henry Jefferson Design Institute, a fully funded program that will identify and support emerging jewelry designers from underrepresented communities. The first campus will open in Charleston, in the same neighborhood where Henry lived." Richard leaned forward, his face a mix of emotions. "Mrs. Washington, while I appreciate the sentiment, this kind of dramatic change could unsettle our existing customer base. Change unsettles everything, Mr. Morton. That's how we know it's working." Pearl began signing the acquisition documents with her father's fountain pen, the one he'd used to sign his first lease in 1962, when most banks wouldn't even let him open an account. "But if you're concerned about the business impact, let me show you something else." She gestured to her assistant, Michael, who had been quietly waiting by the door. He distributed tablets to everyone in the room, each displaying a comprehensive business plan. The Institute isn't just about correcting historical wrongs. It's about tapping into an untapped market. Did you know that black consumers spent $2.1 billion on luxury jewelry last year? And yet less than 1% of luxury jewelry designers are black. Pearl swiped through the presentation, revealing market analyses, demographic studies, and projected growth charts. "By diversifying our designer pool, we'll reach new customers while maintaining our existing base. The Morton name will become synonymous not just with luxury, but with innovation and inclusion." She could see the lawyers' expressions shifting from skepticism to interest as they reviewed the numbers. Richard Morton himself sat back in his chair, studying Pearl with new eyes. "There's something else you should know," Pearl added, her voice softening. "That young woman in your Boston store, Cassidy, she's not just putting herself through college, she's studying jewelry design. I spoke with her this morning. She has remarkable talent, but no one ever bothered to ask about her sketches. She'll be in the first class at the Institute." Richard set down his tablet, running a hand through his gray hair. "You've thought of everything, haven't you?" "Not everything," Pearl smiled. "Just the important parts. Now, shall we finish the paperwork? I have a press conference at 2, and there's a young designer in Boston I promised to meet for coffee afterward." As the lawyers began exchanging documents, Pearl's phone buzzed with a message from Regina. "Did you tell them about Henry?" "Just did," Pearl typed back. Change is coming to Providence. Looking out over the city that would soon house her newest venture, Pearl thought about Henry Jefferson, sketching designs by candlelight after long days of work. She thought about her father, counting coins in his leather repair shop, dreaming of something bigger. She thought about Cassidy, hiding her drawings beneath sales receipts, afraid to show them to anyone. Sometimes, Pearl reflected, the most valuable things in a jewelry store weren't the gems in the cases, but the dreams locked away in the hearts of those who worked there. It was time to set those dreams free. The Charleston sun beat down on the abandoned warehouse district, where a crowd had gathered around a makeshift stage. Construction equipment stood ready in the background, bright yellow against the weathered brick buildings. Pearl adjusted her microphone, scanning the faces before her. Community leaders, aspiring designers, local press, and, most importantly, the Jefferson family. Marie Jefferson, Henry's granddaughter, sat in the front row, clutching a velvet box containing her grandfather's original tools. At 82, she had her grandfather's eyes, bright, observant, filled with an artist's way of seeing the world. When Pearl had tracked her down to share her plans for the Institute, Marie had wept, opening an old trunk filled with more of Henry's sketches. "Today," Pearl began, her voice carrying across the hushed crowd, "we're not just breaking ground on a building. We're breaking ground on a new future." She gestured to the warehouse behind her. In 1923, less than a mile from where we stand, Henry Jefferson created designs that would define American jewelry for generations. Today, we honor his legacy by creating opportunities for the next generation of visionaries. As Pearl spoke, she noticed a familiar face slipping into the crowd. Cassidy, still looking somewhat out of place in her business casual attire, had flown down from Boston for the ceremony. Their coffee meeting had turned into a 3-hour conversation about design, dreams, and the courage to pursue them. The young woman's portfolio had revealed a distinctive style that blended classical techniques with contemporary African influences, work that deserved to be seen. The Henry Jefferson Design Institute will be more than a school, Pearl continued. It will be an incubator, a workshop, and a community. Each year, we will accept 50 students for our full scholarship program. They will learn from master craftsmen, study business management, and develop their own collections. But perhaps most importantly, she paused, making eye contact with Marie, they will learn their own history. Pearl motioned to Michael, who unveiled a large display featuring Henry Jefferson's original sketches, digitally restored and enlarged. Gasps rippled through the crowd as people stepped forward to examine the intricate designs. These sketches, Pearl gestured to the display, represent both our past and our future. They show us what's possible when talent meets opportunity. And speaking of possibility, she smiled at Cassidy. "I'd like to introduce our first student designer, Miss Cassidy Chun. Would you please join me?" Cassidy's eyes widened in surprise. This hadn't been part of the program. Pearl had planned it this way, knowing the young woman would have declined out of nervousness if asked in advance. After a gentle nudge from those around her, Cassidy made her way to the stage. "Miss Chen recently shared some of her designs with me," Pearl continued, as Michael revealed another display, this time showing Cassidy's work. "Notice the way she captures movement in metal, the way she honors traditional techniques while creating something entirely new. This is the future of Morton's. This is the future of American jewelry design." Cassidy stood straighter as the crowd murmured appreciatively over her sketches. Pearl could see the moment the young woman realized she belonged here. It was the same realization Pearl herself had experienced decades ago, standing in Regina's office at Harvard. After the ceremony, as construction crews began their work in the background, Pearl watched Marie Jefferson and Cassidy deep in conversation, bent over Henry's original tools and Cassidy's sketchbook. Marie was explaining her grandfather's technique for setting marquise diamonds, her weathered hands tracing the shapes in the air. "You know," Regina said, appearing at Pearl's side, "when you told me about buying Morton's, I thought it was about revenge. But it's not, is it? It's about healing." Pearl thought about the long chain of events that had led to this moment, from a young girl sweeping floors in Birmingham to a nervous saleswoman in Boston to an old man's forgotten sketches. "Why not both?" she replied, watching as Marie demonstrated a wire wrapping technique to an enthralled Cassidy. Sometimes the best way to heal old wounds is to make sure they never happen to anyone else. The sound of construction machinery filled the air as the first walls of the institute began to take shape. Pearl had chosen this location carefully. The warehouse district was being revitalized, and the institute would anchor the neighborhood's transformation, just as she had transformed Morton's from a symbol of exclusion to one of opportunity. Next week, we break ground in Detroit, Pearl told Regina, already thinking ahead. Then Chicago. By this time next year, we'll have institutes in 5 cities. And what about the stores? Regina asked. Pearl smiled, watching Cassidy carefully handle Henry's ancient pliers. The stores are changing too. Every Morton's location will have a design studio and workshop. Our customers won't just buy jewelry. They'll be able to watch it being created, meet the designers, understand the stories behind each piece. As the sun began to set over Charleston, casting long shadows across the construction site, Pearl thought about all the Henry Jeffersons still out there. All the talented hands and creative minds just waiting for their chance. She had found her legacy, and it was bigger than revenge, bigger than success, bigger even than healing. It was about creating a future where no one would ever be ignored at a jewelry counter again. The anonymous email arrived on a Wednesday morning, just as Pearl was reviewing designs for the Detroit Institute. You're destroying Morton's legacy. Not everyone wants your kind of change. Back off before you regret it. Pearl sat back in her leather chair in the Providence headquarters, letting out a slow breath. The message wasn't entirely unexpected. In the 3 months since the acquisition, there had been pushback, subtle at first, then increasingly overt. Several longtime customers had publicly canceled their accounts. A few veteran employees had resigned. But this was different. A knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. "Come in, Michael." Her assistant entered, tablet in hand, his usually calm demeanor slightly ruffled. "Mrs. Washington, we have a situation at the Charleston Institute. Someone broke in last night." Pearl's hand tightened on her mouse. "Was anyone hurt?" "No, ma'am. But—" Michael hesitated. "They damaged some of the displays, including Henry Jefferson's original sketches." The quiet that followed was heavy with history. Pearl thought of Marie Jefferson's face when she'd first seen her grandfather's work properly displayed, thought of the tears in the old woman's eyes. "Show me." The security footage played on her monitor. 3 figures in dark clothing, faces covered, methodically destroying display cases and spray painting walls. But what caught Pearl's attention was their efficiency. They knew exactly where to go, which areas to target. "This was an inside job," she said quietly. Someone gave them the layout. She reached for her phone, dialing Regina's number. "Cancel my meetings for the next 2 days. Have the jet ready in an hour." By the time Pearl's plane touched down in Charleston, social media was buzzing with news of the vandalism. Some comments were supportive, others less so. "Morton's should stick to selling jewelry, not social justice," read one. "Get woke, go broke," proclaimed another. The Institute's entrance hall, usually filled with natural light and the quiet hum of creativity, was now a crime scene. Glass crunched under Pearl's heels as she surveyed the damage. Cassidy, who had been teaching her first workshop series, stood near the ruined displays, her face pale but determined. "They tried to destroy your sketches too," Cassidy said, gesturing to a scattered pile of papers. "But I had the originals in the vault. I always lock them up at night, ever since you taught me about Henry Jefferson." Pearl squeezed the young woman's shoulder, proud of her foresight. "How are the students taking it?" "They're angry, scared, but mostly they're determined." Cassidy picked up a broken picture frame containing a photo of Henry Jefferson. "We were supposed to have our first exhibition next week. 25 new designers showing their work. And we still will," Pearl declared, an idea forming. She turned to Michael. "Get me Richard Morton free on the phone. Then call every media outlet in Charleston and find out if Marie Jefferson can be here by tomorrow morning." The next day, Pearl stood before a crowd twice the size of the groundbreaking ceremony. News cameras rolled as she addressed the gathering, her voice steady and clear. "Yesterday, someone tried to remind us of our place," she began. "They thought they could scare us with broken glass and spray paint. But what they don't understand is that we've been putting ourselves back together for generations. Creating beauty from broken things is what we do. She gestured to where Richard Morton III stood uncomfortably among the students and staff. Mr. Morton has something to say. Richard stepped forward, clearing his throat. Pearl had given him a choice during their late-night phone call: publicly denounce the vandalism and announce increased support for the Institute, or face a very public exploration of Morton's historical treatment of minority artisans. Effective immediately, Richard announced, Morton's is establishing a $1 million emergency fund for minority-owned jewelry businesses affected by discrimination or vandalism. Additionally, we are doubling the number of scholarships available at all future Institute locations. Pearl watched the crowd's reaction, noting the mix of surprise and satisfaction, but she wasn't done yet. She nodded to Michael, who unveiled a new display: dozens of sketches and designs, some created by Institute students, others by established designers who had flown in overnight to show their support. Our exhibition opens next week as planned, Pearl announced, and it will now include a special showcase of Black jewelry designers throughout history, from Henry Jefferson to the present day. Because you cannot vandalize a legacy, you cannot spray paint over talent, and you cannot break the spirit of artists who have already survived so much worse. Marie Jefferson stepped forward then, clutching her grandfather's toolbox. And I'll be teaching a master class, she announced, her voice quavering but proud, using these same tools my grandfather used. Because his story didn't end in that workshop in 1923. It continues to every student here. As the applause died down, Pearl noticed Cassidy slipping away from the crowd, heading toward the damaged display cases. Following her, Pearl found the young woman already cleaning, carefully collecting shards of glass. You don't have to do that alone, Pearl said softly. That's the whole point. Cassidy looked up, tears in her eyes but a smile on her face. I know, but sometimes you have to start somewhere, right? Even if it's just picking up pieces. Pearl picked up a broom, standing shoulder to shoulder with her protégé. Together, they began the work of rebuilding, knowing that each piece of glass they swept away was making room for something new to shine. The night of the exhibition, the Charleston Institute gleamed like a jewel box. Where broken glass had littered the floor just a week ago, now elegant display cases formed intimate galleries. The walls, freshly painted in warm cream, served as backdrops for the designers' stories, photographs, sketches, and personal narratives that traced their journeys from dream to reality. Pearl stood in the entrance, greeting guests in a gown designed by a local Charleston artist, adorned with jewelry created by the Institute's first class. Each piece she wore had been chosen with purpose: earrings by a young designer from Haiti, a bracelet from a Native American artisan, and a necklace collaboratively designed by Cassidy and Marie Jefferson. Mrs. Washington, a familiar voice called. Pearl turned to find Mr. Barrett, the former Boston store manager, shifting nervously from foot to foot. I hope it's okay that I came. Cassidy invited me. Edward, Pearl smiled, using his first name deliberately. Of course it's okay. Have you seen her new collection yet? He shook his head, and Pearl noticed he was clutching what appeared to be a small, vintage jewelry box. Actually, I brought something that might interest you. He opened the box, revealing an aged gold pendant. This was my grandmother's. She was a jeweler in Poland before the war. When she came to America, no one would hire her. She cleaned houses for 30 years, but she never stopped making jewelry at night. Pearl studied the pendant's intricate filigree work, recognizing the master craftsmanship in every detail. Would you consider letting us display it in our historical collection? Edward's eyes widened. You'd want to? Every piece of jewelry tells a story, Edward. Every artist who was told no is part of our story. She gestured to Michael, who carefully took the box. Now, let me show you what Cassidy has been working on. They made their way through the crowded galleries, where hundreds of guests mingled with designers, watching demonstrations and hearing the stories behind each piece. In one corner, Marie Jefferson sat surrounded by students, her grandfather's tools spread out before her as she demonstrated traditional techniques. In another, Richard Morton III was deep in conversation with a group of Detroit community leaders about the next Institute location. They found Cassidy in the Central Gallery, where her collection held pride of place. The young woman who had once ignored Pearl at a jewelry counter now stood confident and poised, explaining her design process to an enthusiastic crowd. Her pieces combine traditional craftsmanship with bold, contemporary elements, a bridge between past and future. "I had no idea," Edward murmured, taking in the sophisticated designs. "All those times she was at the counter, sketching between customers. Sometimes we miss what's right in front of us," Pearl replied gently. "The trick is learning to look harder." As the evening progressed, Pearl made her way to a small, private gallery at the back of the building. Here, protected by museum-grade security glass, hung the restored sketches of Henry Jefferson, but now they were accompanied by something new. A digital display showing how his original designs had influenced contemporary pieces, including several by current Institute students. Regina found her there, contemplating the exhibition. "You know what this reminds me of?" her old friend asked, gesturing to the busy galleries beyond. "That night in your dorm room, when you showed me your business plan for Washington Digital, everyone said you were crazy to leave IBM, but you knew something they didn't. That technology could create opportunities." Pearl nodded. "But this is different, Regina. This is about creating something that will outlast us." "Is it?" Regina smiled. "Seems to me you're still in the opportunity business, just with better jewelry." A commotion from the main gallery drew their attention. Cassidy was unveiling her final piece, a spectacular necklace that incorporated elements from Henry Jefferson's original designs with her own contemporary style. The crowd gasped appreciatively as the lights caught the diamonds. The Morton Classic setting, Cassidy explained to the gathered audience, was revolutionary because it created the illusion of diamonds floating in light. Henry Jefferson understood that sometimes the space between things is as important as the things themselves. She touched the necklace reverently. "This piece honors that principle, but adds elements of movement and asymmetry that reflect our modern world." Pearl watched as Marie Jefferson made her way forward, tears streaming down her face as she embraced Cassidy. The young designer held out the necklace, helping Marie try it on. The moment seemed to crystallize everything Pearl had been working toward: past and present, pain and healing, all captured in a single piece of jewelry. Later, as the crowd began to thin, Pearl found Cassidy sitting quietly in the workshop, sketching something new. "Ready to call it a night?" "Almost." Cassidy looked up, her eyes bright with creative energy. "I just had an idea for the Detroit collection, something about industrial architecture and Art Deco." Pearl pulled up a chair, recognizing the familiar fire of inspiration. "Tell me more." As Cassidy explained her vision, Pearl glanced around the workshop where dozens of new designers were finding their voices. Through the windows, she could see the Charleston night, the same sky under which Henry Jefferson had once sketched his dreams. Some might have called it revenge, this transformation of Morton's. But sitting here, watching creativity bloom where once there had been only closed doors, Pearl knew it was something else entirely. It was justice, wrapped in beauty, set in gold. 1 year after the Charleston exhibition, Pearl sat in her office in Providence, reviewing applications for the newest Institute location in Oakland. The stack of portfolios on her desk represented more than just aspiring designers. They were dreams taking flight, 5 cities at a time. A notification popped up on her computer screen. "Turn on CNN Business." The message was from Regina. Pearl clicked the link, and there was Cassidy, poised and professional, being interviewed about Morton's revolutionary apprenticeship program. "What we're doing isn't just about jewelry," Cassidy was saying, her confidence a far cry from the nervous saleswoman of a year ago. "It's about creating economic ecosystems in communities that have historically been excluded from luxury markets." The camera panned to show the Detroit Institute, where Cassidy now served as creative director. The industrial-inspired space hummed with activity, students working at benches, master craftspeople teaching traditional techniques, and in one corner, a group of high school students getting their first introduction to the trade through Morton's new youth outreach program. Pearl's phone buzzed with another message, this time from Marie Jefferson. "Are you watching? Our girl is making Henry proud." Before Pearl could respond, her office door opened and Michael entered, carrying a familiar-looking envelope. "It's from the Smithsonian," he said, handing it to her. Pearl opened it carefully, though she already knew what it contained. The National Museum of African American History and Culture wanted to create a permanent exhibition about Black jewelers in America. featuring Henry Jefferson's story at its center. They were requesting his original tools, currently on loan to the Charleston Institute. "Have you told Marie?" Michael asked. "Not yet," Pearl replied. Watching as Cassidy on the screen explained how Morton's new collections were breaking sales records while transforming the industry. "I think she should be the one to decide." A soft chime indicated another visitor. Edward Barrett stood in the doorway, looking much more at ease than he had a year ago. After the exhibition, Pearl had offered him a choice: retirement with full benefits, or a chance to help build something new. He'd chosen the latter, and now headed Morton's corporate training program, teaching employees about the history they'd never learned in the future they could help create. "The first class of corporate trainees just graduated," he reported, barely containing his pride. 98% completion rate. "And 3 of them are already enrolled in design courses?" Pearl nodded approvingly. "And the new hiring initiatives?" 40% of our store managers are now people of color," Edward replied. "We're on track to hit 50% by year's end. And customer satisfaction scores are the highest they've been in Morton's history." On the TV, Cassidy was showing off her latest collection, pieces that told stories of migration, resilience, and triumph. Each design incorporated elements from different cultural traditions, creating something entirely new yet deeply rooted in history. "Mrs. Washington," Michael interrupted gently, "it's time for your meeting with the Goldman Sachs Foundation. They're interested in funding similar programs in other industries." Pearl gathered her things, pausing to watch the final moments of Cassidy's interview. The young designer was asked about her inspiration. "I learned that success isn't about proving others wrong," Cassidy said, touching the necklace she wore, the same one she'd created for the Charleston exhibition. "It's about proving yourself right. Every piece I design is a conversation between past and present, between what was denied and what's now possible." The interviewer leaned forward. "And what made that clear to you?" Cassidy smiled, and Pearl could see traces of that nervous young woman from the Boston store, transformed but not erased. "Someone took the time to really see me," she said, "and then taught me to see myself." Pearl switched off the TV, her throat tight with emotion. On her desk, next to the Smithsonian letter, sat a small velvet box. Inside was a simple gold pendant, designed by one of her Detroit students, a key, transformed into a rising sun. "Michael," she said, putting on her jacket, "after the Goldman meeting, I need you to set up calls with every major luxury retail brand in the country." "More acquisitions?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. Pearl touched the pendant at her throat. "More opportunities. Morton's was just the beginning. There are other Henry Jeffersons out there, in every industry, other Cassidys, waiting to be seen." She smiled, remembering that day in Boston when she'd been ignored at a jewelry counter. Sometimes all it takes is one door opening to change everything. As she headed to her meeting, Pearl could feel the weight of history lifting, transforming into something lighter, brighter, like diamonds catching the light, like dreams taking flight, like justice wrapped in gold and set with pride. The revolution she'd started wouldn't end with jewelry. It was only just beginning. 5 years had passed since that fateful day in the Boston store. Pearl Washington stood in the newly renovated flagship Morton's location on 5th Avenue in New York City, watching as visitors filled the space for its grand reopening. The store wasn't just a jewelry store anymore. It was a living museum, an educational center, and a testament to transformation. The central display case held something special, a collection titled Legacy, featuring pieces from every graduate of the now 12 institute locations across the country. Each piece told a story, each designer represented a dream realized. But it was the final piece that drew the most attention, a spectacular collaboration between all 500 current institute students, created in honor of the woman who had made it all possible. Mrs. Washington, a young black girl, no more than 16, approached Pearl tentatively. "I'm sorry to bother you, but I've been standing in that corner for an hour, trying to work up the courage to show you something." Pearl's heart skipped a beat as the girl pulled out a worn sketchbook. How many times had this scene played out over the years? How many dreams had started just this way? "What's your name, dear?" Pearl asked, guiding the girl to a quiet corner. "Alexandra. Everyone calls me Alex." She opened her sketchbook with trembling hands. I've been taking classes at the youth program in Detroit. Miss Chun? She told me I should show you these. The sketches were raw but showed remarkable promise. Pearl could see echoes of Henry Jefferson's style, hints of Cassidy's influence, but something entirely unique as well. She was about to respond when a familiar voice interrupted. "Those curves in the metalwork," Marie Jefferson said, appearing beside them. At 87, she moved more slowly now, but her eyes were sharp as ever. "They remind me of my grandfather's early work. May I?" Alex nodded, awestruck. As Marie examined the sketches, Pearl watched the interaction with a full heart, remembering all the moments that had led to this one. Across the store, she could see Edward Barrett teaching a group of young salespeople about the history of black jewelers in America. Near the workshop area, Cassidy was demonstrating techniques to a crowd of aspiring designers, her recent Innovator of the Year award displayed proudly behind her. "You know," Marie said to Alex, "we're having a special summer intensive at the Charleston Institute. Full scholarship. These sketches, I think you might be exactly who we're looking for." Alex's eyes widened. "Really? But I don't know if I could." "That's exactly what Cassidy said," Pearl smiled. "When I first suggested she apply to the Institute, sometimes we need someone else to believe in our dreams before we can fully believe in them ourselves." As Marie led Alex away to discuss application details, Regina appeared at Pearl's side. "You're thinking about Birmingham, aren't you?" her old friend asked softly. Pearl nodded. The memory of that jewelry store floor she'd once swept was still clear, but it no longer carried the sting it once had. "I was thinking about how far we've come, and how far we still have to go." "Well," Regina gestured to where Richard Morton III was proudly showing visitors the new Henry Jefferson Historical Center within the store, "I'd say we're making pretty good progress." The center of the store had been cleared for the evening's main event. Pearl made her way to the podium, looking out at the faces before her: students, designers, community leaders, and most importantly, dreamers of all ages who could now see themselves reflected in the gleaming cases around them. "5 years ago," she began, "I walked into a jewelry store and was ignored. Today, we celebrate not just the transformation of an industry, but the power of being seen." She paused, touching the pendant at her throat. Alex's nervous energy reminded her so much of herself at that age. Every piece of jewelry tells a story, but more importantly, every person has a story waiting to be told. Our job isn't just to sell beautiful things, it's to create space for beautiful possibilities. As she spoke, Pearl noticed Alex in the crowd, clutching her sketchbook like a lifeline, Marie's supportive hand on her shoulder. She saw Cassidy, who had become like a daughter to her, beaming with pride beside her latest collection. She saw Edward, who had learned that it's never too late to change. And she saw all the faces yet to come, all the dreams yet to be realized. "Someone once asked me if buying Morton's was about revenge," Pearl continued. "What revenge is about looking backward. What we've built here is about looking forward. It's about creating a future where no one has to break down doors because those doors are already open." After the ceremony, as the crowd began to disperse, Pearl found herself alone in the workshop. She ran her hand along a workbench, feeling the subtle marks and scratches that told of countless hours of creation. On the wall hung a photograph of that first Boston store, next to a current image of all 12 Institute locations. "Mrs. Washington?" It was Alex again, still clutching her sketchbook. "I just wanted to say thank you, not just for today, but for making all of this possible. For making it possible for someone like me to dream this big." Pearl smiled, remembering a young girl in Birmingham who had once pressed her face against a jewelry store window, dreaming of possibilities that seemed impossible then. "Dreams," she told Alex, "are like diamonds. They're formed under pressure. They take time to polish, but with the right setting, with the right opportunity, they can light up the whole world." As they stood there, surrounded by the tools of creation and the echoes of history, Pearl Washington knew that her story wasn't ending. It was multiplying, refracting like light through a perfectly cut diamond, spreading out into countless new beginnings. And somewhere, she thought, Henry Jefferson was smiling.